I ended my marriage at 9:17 a.m. on a Tuesday with a single sentence that sounded calmer than the blood in my ears, and across the table my wife froze in her lawyer's conference room chair as she realized the emergency plan she had spent months arranging had already failed before the coffee went cold. Because the accounts she thought she had mapped with surgical precision were empty in the places she expected them to be full and full in the places she hadn't learned existed, the house she believed she could force me to sell was already protected. The operating company she assumed she could carve like a pie had quietly become an entity she couldn't reach, and the intellectual property she used to call my hobby code was no longer mine in any way a divorce judge could divide, and I watched her eyes move like a second hand until they landed on the signature at the bottom of a filing she did not understand. A filing dated 2 weeks earlier, the day I took a long walk and decided the only way to stop being a mark was to start being a man who planned. She had filed first. She wanted the optics, the shock, the leverage. She wanted me to be the one saying wait let's talk. She wanted her lawyer to anchor the room and my lawyer to play defense with a tired smile. She wanted the story about how I had become distant and unreasonable and how her career had suffered while I chased dreams. And she wanted the table to tilt toward the sympathetic lighting she always finds, but when her counsel slid the proposed temporary orders across the table and cleared his throat in that dignified way lawyers learn in the first week of expensive school, my attorney didn't even look down. He just tapped the corner of our response packet with one finger, and said we declined to stipulate, and her face did a small involuntary thing. A microquake in the cheek that would have broken my heart last year and only registered as geography today. I said I know about the storage unit and the second phone and the account at the credit union with a maiden name scan of your driver's license, and I know about the blank lease at the downtown building your friend manages, and I know about the fitness tracker you forgot to take off the night you told me you were sleeping at your sister's and somehow managed 10,000 steps between midnight and 2, and I know about the consultation with the attorney 3 months before you asked me whether we needed couples therapy, and I know why you switched the joint card to paperless, and I know why you suddenly started calling my business our marital asset at parties, and she tried to make the face, the one where we pretend we misunderstand, the one that kept us married for the last 18 months, and then she realized there was no room left for theater and she folded her hands in her lap and said, "So you moved the money," and I said no. I moved my life 2 weeks before she filed. I had sat in my truck in a grocery store parking lot, staring at a receipt that listed things we didn't eat and wine I didn't drink and a travel-sized toothbrush that made a bigger sound in my head than it ever would in a bathroom, and I understood that the moment you feel yourself starting to beg for clarity is the moment you should hire a different version of yourself. So I called a woman named Rosa who used to be a forensic accountant and now builds fire breaks for people who wait too long to smell smoke, and she told me 3 things in a voice that didn't care whether I cried. She told me to stop talking to my wife about anything that looked like numbers. She told me to stop moving like guilt looks in a surveillance camera, and she told me to stop underestimating anyone who says the word closure more than once in a week. The next morning I opened a bank account with a banker who had the exact tone you want when you're about to discover what you're made of. A tone like a torque wrench, and I put my legitimate salary into it and nothing else, because Rosa said don't touch the marital funds you can't document without looking like the villain in a story written by someone who wants your dog too, and then I transferred the patents and the code repository and the brand to a holding company owned by a trust with a trustee who does not share my last name and who cares about paper more than friendship. And then I licensed everything back to my operating company at fair market rates that any auditor could respect even if they didn't like me. And then I converted my C Corp to a manager-managed LLC with an operating agreement that someone twice as paranoid as me would admire, and then I called the insurance broker and increased my tail coverage because the only thing I fear more than losing is losing twice in the room today. Her lawyer cleared his throat again and asked why I had engaged in such elaborate preemptive restructuring. And I said because I learned to listen to the silences in my own house, and because I love my company more than the future we stopped building together, and because I watched my father lose a business to a man who smiled too much, and I promised a version of myself who still believed in birthdays that I would never let that kind of smile into my books. And the lawyer said his client was disappointed, and my lawyer said my client is alive. You want the backstory because you want to know if I deserved it. We all do that math when we hear about a marriage dying, and I'll tell you the pieces that matter without branding either of us with a single noun, because nouns are for cases and I'm telling you about a person. She was brilliant and ambitious and she made rooms brighter. She also needed those rooms to know she was responsible for the light. I was stubborn and focused and I built a thing out of late nights and coffee that lots of people in suits wanted to own. I also assumed love meant we were both on the same side of the table even when money sat down between us and asked for a vote. My best friend since college, Tom, was also my co-founder. He knew the hunger and he knew the code and he knew the jokes you make at 2 in the morning when the server racks sound like rain. He knew my habits and my passwords and my tells at poker and the way I say the word, almost, when I'm about to ship something. He stood next to me at my wedding and said the toast people still quote when they need to describe loyalty. And when I tell you later what he did you will want to rewind the tape and find a clue on his face. You won't. He was built for trust the way some people are built for sprinting. The first time I suspected my wife was consulting a lawyer was not the day I found the intake email disguised as a newsletter. It was the day she started using the right vocabulary. She began to say equitable distribution and temporary orders, the way a person who actually cares would say vacation and weekend, and she started calling my counsel your guy, as if naming him next to me was a way to put him in my pocket. She also started asking strangely specific questions about vesting schedules and satisfaction clauses in vendor agreements, and when I asked how work was she said, transformational, in a way that made me think of wrecking balls painted like disco. So I asked Rosa what to do when your wife starts to sound like someone who took a class on your spine. And she said document what is yours, clarify what is ours, and put strangers between you and your panic. So I did the work I should have done when things were good and we were drunk on the idea that being in love is the same as being prepared. I listed every account, every safe deposit box, every recurring subscription, every title and deed and policy and warranty. I printed it all and put it in a binder with tabs like I was taking an exam I could finally pass. And then I made copies and put them in 2 places that were not my house and not my office, and then I called a different lawyer than the one we always laughed with at fundraisers, a woman who had the reputation of being boring, and she was a revelation, because in crisis boring is integrity you can set your coffee on. Then I waited, because that is the hardest part of being right. You have to wait for someone else to think their move is their idea, and the day came like weather. She picked a Tuesday because people don't dramatize on Tuesdays, and she served me papers with language that managed to be both sterile and vicious, and I read them at the kitchen island we picked because it made the space feel like a home, and I understood that some furniture is only ever a stage. When we finished in the lawyer's office we didn't speak in the elevator, and on the sidewalk she said, you didn't have to humiliate me, and I said, I didn't, I just stopped letting you practice on me, and she said, you moved everything, and I said, I moved what you married me to build because I'm the one who stayed up when your phone died at 10, and she said, I never cheated. And I said, neither did I, and the truth of that sat between us like unwanted furniture, because this wasn't about sex, it was about power and exits and whether you can walk away with both. If the story ended there you would think it was simple math. Wife plans divorce and tries to take the thing, husband smells it and moves the thing, courtroom, settlement, bruised dignity and new leases, but you asked for the twist and I lived it. And I didn't see it until a Thursday night when I found a file in a shared drive that didn't belong to any of the folders I touch, a file with a name that looked like a typo and a last modified date that wasn't supposed to exist, and when I opened it I felt the kind of quiet that means the air is learning a new language. It was a tranche of draft term sheets and emails and a PowerPoint with a cover that said, Project Harbor, and harbor was a word Tom and I had used in college for the bar where we first decided to build something that would outlast hangovers. And on slide 5 was my wife's name next to my best friend's initials, and the minutes of a dinner I didn't attend. Project Harbor was a plan, and if you are the kind of person who thinks in plans you know a plan when you see it. It was thick with assumptions and dates and phrases that don't belong in a friendship. It detailed a timeline for courting my wife before we got married to ensure proximity to me that couldn't be questioned. It mapped Keyman clauses in our early investor agreements and listed what would happen to voting control if I were deemed incapacitated, divorced, or in breach of fiduciary duty. It laid out narrative strategies for a divorce that would position me as erratic and brilliant but unstable. It mocked up a press release for a leadership transition that would move Tom into the CEO seat temporarily, while the board supported me through a challenging personal period. And in the footnotes it referenced a public relations firm I recognized from a crisis someone else had last year. If you have ever felt the ground beneath you decide it prefers somebody else, you know what I felt, and I didn't tell anyone for an hour because sometimes betrayal is a private room you have to walk through alone before you say words out loud that make it real. Then I called Rosa and I called my boring lawyer and I called a man who used to work for a regulator and now plays chess with people who don't realize they've put their queen on a free square. And I sent them the file and they all said the same thing: do not confront yet, do not burn the evidence by letting it know it has been seen, lock everything down and make a copy that a flood can't hurt, and then ask your board chair to breakfast. Our board chair is a retired woman who wears the same watch to funerals and IPOs, and she liked me the way people like you when you have made them money but kept your soul. And when I showed her the file she did not say "oh my God" the way people in movies say it. She said, "I thought something was off when Tom suggested we bring in adult supervision for you last quarter," and I said, "You thought that and you didn't call me," and she said, "I did, and you told me you were fine," and we both looked at our coffee like it's the kind of thing that should come with instructions. We built a plan that looked like the opposite of Project Harbor, a plan that did not assume the worst about anyone, just documented it carefully in case the worst insisted on being true. I moved a board meeting up under the cover of presenting the quarterly numbers. I invited our outside counsel to sit in and I told Tom I wanted him to lead the product section because I was buried in customer stuff, and I sat at the head of the table and watched the man I would have taken a bullet for walk through my code like a realtor holding an open house. And when he got to the slide about optionality and leadership, I asked him to define that word, and he gave me the speech about resilience and redundancy and how companies need to be bigger than one man, and I said, "Good, that's why we've prepared these materials," and I clicked to a slide that had 3 bullet points and a date and the words, Project Harbor, in a font that made the room feel warmer, and then I put the printouts of the file on the table in front of each director like communion, and the chair said, "We'll take a break," and Tom said, "This is out of context," and I said, "Context is a coward's last defense," and he said, "You don't understand," and I said, "I think I understand enough to ask for your resignation pending a full review." The men who always have jokes didn't have any. The women on the board who always noticed the detail noticed the thing I needed them to, that the file listed misrepresentations to investors we had not yet made but planned to if the plan continued, and our counsel did not need to be dramatic, he just needed to open a notebook and start a list of dates. And Tom tried a pivot to concern, the kind good liars learn when they realize charm has left the building. He said he had been worried about me. He said my wife had confided that I was spiraling. He said he only wanted to protect the company from my volatility, and I looked at him and saw the freshman who copied my answers and the 25-year-old who stole my spare hoodie and the 30-year-old who slept on my couch when his girlfriend left because he forgot to text her on her birthday, and I said, "You made my marriage a means to a cap table, and I don't know how to put that in a spreadsheet." We voted to suspend him pending investigation. We locked his access. We called in a neutral firm to image every device he touched, and we told IT to act like the building was on fire without setting off the sprinklers. And then I went home to an empty house and sat on the floor and laughed for the first time in weeks because sometimes survival feels like a joke you finally get. And then I cried because somewhere between slide 5 and the signatures my life had turned into a set of rooms where I didn't trust the furniture. The divorce continued like divorces do, slow and humiliating and expensive, but it also shifted, because the plan my wife thought she was running had lost its director. She asked me once, over email because our lawyers had finally taught us new manners, whether I had known about her friendship with Tom, and I said, "I know about Harbor," and she didn't reply for 2 days and then sent a message that said, "I didn't know the whole of it," and I believed her, not because she deserved it or I am a saint, but because the file had the cadence of a man who enjoyed being the smartest person in a room. He designed. Rosa told me to keep my head down and my receipts up. My lawyer told me to keep my statements dry and my tone drier. My board chair told me to keep my calendar predictable and my face boring, and I did. And in that boredom I remembered what it feels like to write code without anyone watching and to eat dinner at a table that isn't a negotiation. And when my wife's lawyer finally realized there was no jackpot to harvest, he began to talk about amicable terms, and we settled, and the settlement looked like two people who do not need to love each other to stop hurting each other, and she kept the condo her friend managed and the car that used to be ours and the furniture she cared about more than I did, and she got a check that would have felt like a hill of money to me at 25 and felt like a fair receipt at 38, and she signed a mutual non-disparagement that my board chair suggested because she understands that revenge on the record is just marketing. You want the revenge though, you want the part where the man who mapped my life like a hostile takeover learns about gravity, and you want me to say I ruined him, and I won't say that, because what happened is worse for people like him. What happened is that the story became public on its own, not in the newspapers and not in the feeds, but in the emails people send each other when they wonder whether their CFO is sleeping well. The investigation documented what it documented. We turned over what we turned over. We didn't call the press, we called the people with badges who never raised their voices, and when all the pieces were aligned enough that the picture was obvious to anyone with a pulse, our counsel drafted a letter with a list of exhibits and sent it to the right place, and one morning the office door Tom used to walk through opened for different men and they asked for his laptop and asked him to sit, and he called me and tried to make jokes and I said, I never want to hear your voice in my life again, and I meant it. The board appointed an interim COO with a jaw built for bad news. I took a lower title because I wanted to write again instead of standing in rooms convincing people we were still us, and the company didn't die, because companies don't die of gossip, they die of cash flow and cowardice, and we had neither, and I watched a team of people who remembered why we began keep the lights on without clapping for themselves. And in that work I found a version of forgiveness I didn't expect, the kind that doesn't absolve or forget, the kind that looks like patience months later, when the case became a quiet file in a cabinet that smells like toner and disappointment. I met my ex-wife at a coffee shop because our lawyers said it could help us stop haunting each other, and we said polite things and mean things and true things, and when we were leaving she said, "Did you ever love me?" And I said, "Yes," and she said, "Then why did you move everything?" And I said, "Because the person I loved wasn't the person you became when someone offered you a story with a better wardrobe," and she nodded like the kind of person who will one day call a friend and say I was the villain that time, and the friend will say no no and she will say yes yes, and we will both be right. The catharsis, if you're still listening for it, didn't come when the judge signed the final decree. It didn't come when Tom lost his job or his options or his ability to charm a room full of people who learned to read. It came on a night my house felt like a place again and not a museum. I turned on a lamp and the light was ordinary, and I made dinner in a pan I had forgotten I liked, and I ate it standing up because I could, and I sent my board chair a photo of a bug fix I'd committed at some ungodly hour, and she wrote back one line, "Welcome home." And I sat down in the silence and realized that revenge had been my scaffolding, but the building I wanted was peace. If you want the last twist, it's small and it's everything. A month after the decree I took a walk past the grocery store where I once sat counting toothbrushes like omens, and I ran into Rosa outside with a cart full of things that turn houses into places people live, and I said, "How do I pay you back for what you did?" And she said, "You already did, you listened," and then she pointed across the lot to a woman returning a cart who smiled at me like she recognized me from a better story, and Rosa said, "That's my sister, she's a carpenter who loves bad puns and dogs that don't listen," and for a second I felt my face do the involuntary thing, the microquake I had learned to hate on myself when it meant weakness and to trust when it meant wonder, and I walked over and said hello and made a joke about carts that never lock right and got one back about people who think they can steer them, and I laughed in the new way, the one that doesn't need an audience, and I asked if she wanted coffee sometime, and she said, "I build tables for a living, I don't sit at many, so coffee is good." And the moral, if there is one, is that sometimes the house you were trying to defend wasn't worth the fortifications, and sometimes the life you find on the other side of a plan designed to hurt you is not a victory or a headline but a room with a lamp and a laugh you recognize as your own, and you get to sit in that room without watching the door, and you get to choose who knocks, and when they do, you open, not because you won, but because you are done losing yourself. To people who spell love like leverage.